Daphne said, I'm in Stratford, Ontario, alas, not UK. I wish I were there with you at the faculty club, though, because you're getting a chance to meet and hear our speaker in person today, but I'm happy to attend along with others of the college on Zoom. So I've been lucky enough to know Andrea Charise since she was a graduate student, I guess, in English here at the U of T, and for a time she was our research assistant. Michael and I were also part of an interdisciplinary working group at the Jackman Humanities Institute on, if I can get this right, Andrea will have to correct me if not, aging, old age, memory, and aesthetics. Andrea co-organized this with Marlene Goldman. Now, at that time, she was completing what was to be a Polanyi Prize-winning doctoral dissertation on how 19th century British novelists represented older age at an historical moment when traditional models of life course narratives were being totally rethought. She then did a prestige postdoc at the University of Iowa and then published a book based, I think, on the dissertation called The Aesthetics of Senescence, Aging, Population in the 19th Century British Novel. In this, she studied what she studied in the thesis, the cultural conceptualizations of older age, but she extended her range beyond the 19th century into our own, what she calls aging averse moment as well. And this is, I have to say, typical of Andrea's research. She always kind of brings it home somehow. So as a student, though, she was well qualified to do this interesting kind of interdisciplinary research. She came to us having spent her early years as a medical researcher in clinical epidemiology and geriatrics. So a few years later, who better to co-edit the 2020 massive volume called The Routledge Companion to Health Humanities, and it's a brick. Who better to inaugurate then a health humanities undergraduate program at UTSC? And this was the first in Canada. Andrea currently holds the rank of associate professor in UTSC's Department of Health and Society, a department that she helped create. And I'm going to open a parenthesis that I mentioned, David and I were talking about before we started. This is also a department with which Senior College is about to have a new and I think very exciting relationship. So stay tuned. We can't announce this till October 1st. Back to Andrea. So from giving keynotes at medical humanities conferences to grand rounds at hospitals, she really has become the speaker to invite on humanistic approaches to health studies. But her students knew this already, and I can't resist reading this to you. This is from ratemyprofessors.com. One of her students wrote, and I quote, "Dr. Charise is an incredibly talented professor, the most charismatic I have ever had. Her passion for what she teaches has driven me to develop a strong interest in health humanities. I was mesmerized by her ability to creatively intertwine the disciplines of art, humanities, and health studies. She makes UTSC special." End of quote. And our university recognized her special pedagogical talent in 2020 when she received its Early Career Teaching Award. I could go on, though she's young, her CV is long, believe me. I could tell you that she's the founding director and principal investigator of something called SCOPE, S-C-O-P-E, the Health Humanities Learning Lab, which you can look up online. It's an arts and humanities-based research and education initiative. But today I know she's going to talk to us about another of her grant and award-winning projects, this one involving intergenerational digital storytelling, community-engaged arts, and social wellness. So please join me in welcoming Andrea Charise to speak to us on arts, wellness, and crafting intergenerational communities. Andrea.
Thank you, everyone. Linda, that is such a kind and generous introduction. I just want to acknowledge for a moment before we get started that the hybrid approach that we're taking for this talk means, unfortunately, that I believe all 18 or 19 of you that are online on Zoom, I'm not able to see you. You can see me, which is probably the better part of the deal, but I'm not able to kind of interact with the chat and so on, so long as I'm doing my my talk. So please do use the chat if you want to do your own discussions. If you're online, I'll be really happy to interact with that once we go into the Q&A in the second part of this morning's activity. But right now, and I don't want anyone to get jealous of the other, but I might be looking above the computer, above the camera to the folks that are here in the room, but everyone is equally welcome, and I'm delighted to see you all. Thank you so much for taking the time to come today. So Linda, it is yeah, just a kind of a very special moment for me to have you give an introduction like that. One of the things you'll hear me talk about a lot today is a life course view, thinking of one's life across a series of ages. And in many ways, certainly in very significant parts of my life, Linda, you and Michael, I feel you have been a very important aspect of my own life course and certainly professional development. So I want to thank you for that really generous and very touching introduction. Thank you so much. I'm going to begin today with two acknowledgements. The first, an acknowledgement of the land on which I'm speaking, the land on which we are meeting, and the land on which much of the work that I'll be talking about today was in fact conducted. I want to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates, because for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This is still a meeting place and a home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'd also like to supplement that land acknowledgement with the fact that even though we are meeting in a hybrid fashion and utilizing the digital resources to meet, that land acknowledgements still retain their importance. And I'm thinking of the work done by folks like Jennifer Wemigwans, who want to think about our integration of digital life and digital spaces for meetings. And one of the things Jennifer Wemigwans suggests to us is that Indigenous claims to land are not to be placed aside simply because we are meeting in digital spaces, that the ways that digital infrastructures are built or structured still involve land and land rights, and in many cases, land theft. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that the land on which we meet and the concerns that we have about land also extend or are applicable to, in many ways, the realities of our meeting online as well. And that's something that comes back into my talk in talking about digital storytelling, both what it has to offer us, but then also its, shall we say, its risks or considerations for us to have as well. I'd also like to acknowledge that much of the work, especially the work that I'll talk about in the second half of my presentation, is collaborative. And it is the outcome of many people's contributions. But I will say just at the outset that I just want to give a special acknowledgement to two collaborators in particular, three, pardon me, Celeste Pang, Dirk J. Rodricks, and Nihal El Hadi. So this is, I'm just going to take a quick look. Yes, that's what I think I'm looking at, and that's what everybody else is looking at. I hope, I think, good. A four-part talk for you today, beginning with my own, a few comments. Linda's done a wonderful job of introducing you to my work and interests in aging and in arts-based approaches to health and matters of health. I want to just give you a little bit of a more personal introduction to why age for me, where that work began, both in my personal, professional, and how that kind of interacts with a social, as Linda suggested, an largely age-averse moment, although not exclusively an age-averse moment, as we'll see in just a moment. I also want to then move into some methods that have been very important to me in my more recent work, particularly around digital storytelling and its application to matters of age, aging, and intergenerational relationships. And I will then introduce you in my third part to a particular project that I launched that had a launch date of 2019. Although as these things go, you launch something often that you've been working on for a while. So it had one of its hatchings in 2019 in any case. So I'll share that with you, the Resemblage Project. And then in the sort of final moments of my talk, what I'd like to do is situate that project and the research that I've been talking about thus far in today's discussion in terms of the larger research sort of constellation of projects that I've had the opportunity to lead and be involved in, and to give you a sense of where I see aging and intergenerational communities fitting into a larger picture of arts and wellness and community engagement. So I hope that brings it home for you in the way that that Linda promised. Boy, oh boy, fingers crossed for that. So In the first slide, as I said, what I'd like to do is introduce you to just a little bit of a personal background. I don't get this as much anymore, but I used to, when I was a graduate student, have people come up to me and say, oh, what is your research? What are you doing? What are you interested in? And I would say, oh, older age. And they would just be like, why? And this is, again, on the one hand, it was a strange sort of, well, why? Because it's something I want to study. But it was also an opportunity for me to think why I would be getting such a sort of startled reaction, not only from folks that, frankly, I think should know better, those from the arts and humanities, but also a lot of the colleagues and mentors that I was working with in the medical and health sciences as well. So for me, why age, has I think is a question that's important to answer. I would say, especially like in the classroom or for my students that might be inclined to think of aging, and particularly older age, as something that is not yet relevant to them, or hi, welcome, come on in. Or that they don't have a particular investment in at this time. And my hope is by sharing a few details that I can sort of cut out or show in a way that I hope is teacherly, that is an assumption that has some damaging outcomes, and that in fact, we all do better when we start thinking about aging as something that we are doing from the moment of our birth, something that is immediately and always relevant to us, if only from a position of like craven self-interest, that we will all be old if we are so lucky, and we want to ensure that that period of our lives is as rich and supported as it ought to be. So some personal just background, I've always had a personal connection with aging. I was raised in large part by my grandparents. Interacting with older people was never something outstanding or unusual. In fact, I realize now that it was stranger for me to sort of be asked to be friends with younger people, even when I was myself a child. I just found it very comfortable and natural for me in my particular family dynamic, I suppose. And then as, fast forward to when I was conducting my master's degree, I had the opportunity to become a research assistant in the Department of Geriatrics, located at Parkwood Hospital in London, Ontario, affiliated with what is now called Western University. And that was really where my kind of personal interests or affiliations with older age especially began to translate into a clinical and research context. And I had some just terrific mentors there, physicians and geriatricians especially, who were really interested in the ways that my own background in the arts might be brought to bear on some of the work that they're doing in order to improve and enhance care for older people. So that's probably an entirely different conversation, and yet it's an element of my background that I am bringing to this work. It's also an element that when I think about how important it is for folks that are invested in the arts to be thinking about how best to either communicate or translate the value of the arts and humanities to folks that might not be inclined to see those disciplines as valuable. That was I think a really good and intensive starting point for me for learning. We might discuss as to how successful I learned that lesson, but to learning how to interact with really profoundly interdisciplinary audiences across medicine, the health professions, as well as the arts and humanities. So as my personal background began to merge with the professional, I began seeing connections to the world around me. Dominant narratives, if any of us have been interacting with the news, certainly before the pandemic, one of the phrases that always caught my ear was the so-called gray tsunami, which was a metaphor used to not personify, but certainly symbolize the reality of an aging population. And this convergence in language of media, economics, medical knowledge, and just a sense of aging and older age was to sort of, was equivalent to a kind of a social catastrophe. That would be evident in this really sort of intense metaphor of the gray tsunami was just something that kind of perked my ears up as I was a PhD student in the Department of English Literature. And so more generally, though, this association of aging and crisis, as I would go on to discover in my first book, this sense of aging as a crisis was not something that just happened in, say, 1990 or 1980, as I argue in my first book, which I'll talk about in a moment. It actually has really long-standing precedents that go back at least to the very beginning of the 19th century. So I'll introduce you to some of that work. And so those are ways in which the personal, the literary, and the social, all ways in which, for me, aging makes a lot of sense for me to pursue both as a researcher. It also, as a researcher that has, I'd say, really strong ties to a humanities tradition, it's also a way of enabling my research to speak to something that is just sort of important within, and to be able to make that connection with this material, both professionally as well as personally, has been something I've been glad to continue doing over the course of my own professional development. So you'll hear me talk about age studies, and some of you may be thinking, well, age studies, maybe you've heard gerontology. Certainly I was just mentioning geriatrics. If I'm using this phrase, it's because it refers to a field that pays a lot of attention to what the arts and humanities have to offer our understanding of age. So that's what distinguishes it, say, from the field of gerontology, where we might be more inclined to see a lot of like quantitative data, those kinds of studies. Age studies, by contrast, tends to emphasize forms of knowledge that are, again, more qualitative, pardon me, or even arts-based. And in so doing, I think what it does is it allows us to look to the media of creative expression that, as human beings, we've been, practicing for many millennia now, and to sort of see how those habits or traditions of creative expression have something to share and provide us in terms of our knowledge of what it means to grow old. Something that I think is important to, again, introduce you to, if you're not already familiar, is what age studies from a literary perspective might look like. And I certainly don't have time to go over the very rich ways in which an age studies approach has been introduced into literary studies. But I will just say that some of the issues and approaches, which I'm happy to talk about in our Q&A, I gather this is a chatty bunch, so I'm prepared. I was prepared and I am prepared. So I'll look forward to that. But some, and Linda, you're high out there in there. One of the opportunities for thinking about age studies through a literary perspective is in issues such as late styles. So the ways in which authors or composers, what they might, how their own careers creatively might change in particular ways toward the end of their careers. And I'll just make a shout out to Linda and Michael Hutchins' recent book on that, 4 Last Songs. Other things, dementia writing, the impact of dementia on authorly writing, digital textual analysis, and more historical or representational readings. These are, again, just to give you a sense for those of you that might not be familiar, even maybe with what literary studies might involve. I know it's an interdisciplinary audience. Just wanted to give you a sense of the possibilities here. And again, just to, I was told by my publisher, you have to plug your book. It was published the week before the entire world shut down in March 2020. So I think my publisher has asked me to sort of use every opportunity to like tell people that your book exists. So I'll just give you a sense of sort of where I took that literary studies approach to age studies. This is the Canadian edition of the Aesthetics of Senescence. I'll show you the hardcover on the next slide. But in this book, my key claim, my central claim, is that British literature over the course of the 19th century in different ways over the course of that century, but also in meaningfully distinct ways from before that period, became a kind of experimental space where literature and medicine, or texts that we would now recognize as medical, or texts from economics, a range of discipline, philosophy, for example, they all began testing out new ways of thinking, talking, and framing older age, as an aging population began to become a demographic reality at this time for very good reasons. Life expectancy was improving and extending, and other reasons as well. The reality of an aging population became a kind of a character that could be summoned or spoken to in the context, not just of literature, but in other disciplines as well. So there was a very interesting interdisciplinary traffic of portraits of aging, or a sense of what it might mean to grow old. And some of the ways and some of the discussions around what it meant to grow old, wouldn't survive out of that century. So it's interesting to imagine in retrospect, well, if a particular way of thinking had survived or extended itself maybe into our own time, in what ways might we assume or discuss or think about our own aging differently? So that's what I meant by it becoming an experimental space. I don't want to spoil the book for you, but one of the things that doing the research for this book has taught me, and really what age studies, participating in the field of age studies has taught me more generally, is how to listen and why we should listen to moments of apparent incompatibility of age cohorts. When we hear about sort of conflicts between young and old, or generations against generations, that's actually a bellwether of a sort. And that generational conflict, which we're hearing a lot more of, I would say, in the context of post-pandemic recovery, right? Intergenerational interactions, and often sort of the hostility that characterizes one cohort's sort of sense of their access to resources versus that of another. Generational conflict, when it surfaces in literature, becomes a way of expressing or asking us to listen for larger crises in the social sphere. So that was an interesting kind of warning or red flag that came up in my research, and something that has helped me listen differently and more sensitively to discussions around generational conflict, even in our own time now. So in retrospect, the historical period that I treated in that book, and this is the hardcover. There's two competing covers. The one I just showed you was the paperback. This is the hardcover of my book. And the 19th century, in many ways, especially in British literature, does bear resemblance to our own time, right? I mean, that was a time, as Kornblue and Morgan write, a time of income inequality, of financial speculation, of capitalist exploitation, global inequity, a widespread reliance on coal-based energy. There is enough about that historical period to make it, I would say, conceivable to think through as a kind of an analog for our own time. There are, of course, profound differences as well, but sometimes I have found it's nice to look at something that's similar but not the same as our own time, as a way of, again, sensitizing the ways that we are able to sort of talk about and detect differences. So that's been my my reason for turning to the 19th century, at least at that earlier part of my career. That said, now that the book has been published and the years have gone by, I have been more interested in pivoting into more contemporary engagements of this kind of work. And I think there are, beyond just sort of my own personal preferences, there are very good reasons for doing this, or thinking about the need to do this. One of the things that is interesting about age studies is that it tends to take as its default subject a somewhat unusual figure, the figure of the white female and often Western female body. That's unusual in the sense that the female body becomes often the body that is sort of discussed or at the center of a lot of age studies analysis, as opposed to the male body. So that has, of course, its own affordances and interests. That said, the white, the Western, the female, that may or may not speak to, especially in the case of say, the students that I teach, students that I hope one day very soon will be my future colleagues. That doesn't necessarily to speak to the very diverse range of experiences that, whether it's for young people, whether it's for old people, particularly in the context of a city like Toronto, that doesn't necessarily sort of speak to them. So I wanted to pivot with my knowledge into a more contemporary sense of how might age studies be relevant, or how might it better resemble the lived experiences of its learners, practitioners, experiencers of age today. So that's the historical pivot I've made in recent years. Beyond that too, is a commitment, again, personally, somewhat, and then, necessarily professionally, of sort of saying, how do we kind of push age studies, not just to talk about or be relevant to the contemporary moment, but how might we understand age studies as a liberatory possibility? And this is where I'm summoning a kind of an activist energy and an activist opportunity that is enabled by focusing particularly on age. And one of the concepts that's very important to thinking about the liberatory possibilities of aging is in what many circles have begun to discuss as intersectional analyses. And that's a word and a concept that was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw a couple of decades ago. And these are ways of thinking about age, for example, as one of many axes of our identity. So in my case, the axes of identity that are of note to me, there are many more, but would be that, I am a white, cis, female, settler of decidedly middle age here. And so those are going to be a set of axes that necessarily sort of influence my outlook. And I think one of the liberatory possibilities of thinking about age as one of those axes is that it allows us to understand that aging overlaps or becomes an aspect of gender that, again, it changes a gendered experience, right? Or it changes the experience of what it means to grow up in Toronto. If I am an older person, a white older person in a particular area of Toronto, and a white older person in another community in Toronto, that those may be different axes of identity that change the experience of what might otherwise be a shared experience, either around race or age and so on. So how can we introduce aging and age into a more liberatory analysis that really allows us, in short, to live better, more enabled lives in diverse communities together? So one of the ways, and certainly one of the inheritances that I've used in my more recent work, has been to turn to Black and Indigenous feminist theorizations of aging, where this idea of aging as just one axis of our identities, where that's been being practiced for quite some time. So I won't go into the details, but Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler, Leanne Simpson, these are all examples of theorists that have been thinking about race and age as complementary or intersecting axes. And it's with that work in mind that I've been again, thinking about how this more contemporary approach to age studies might go in my own work. There's also the reality of intergenerational action and the role of older age, particularly in activist movements around the world. And I'm thinking particularly Yaya Flautas in Spain, which is an activist group that is specifically built around their identity as grandparents and the need for, as grandparents, to ensure that future generations have accessible and affordable housing, for example. This is a marvelous instance of older age and activism that is thinking about their roles generationally, and the interaction of younger and older folks as having sort of shared interests. So aging and activism is again just one of the kind of points of consciousness or opportunities for us to think about more liberatory analyses of aging. And the opportunity that I'm going to turn to now is also the affordances that are offered up by the digital. And to talk about the digital, here we are on Zoom. Hi. We have, certain affordances. Those of you, I don't know where we're all coming from on Zoom, but we have the ability to be places where we might not be able to be otherwise. And that is, again, a profound affordance of digital life. Something I'm going to be talking about in just a moment is the phenomenon of spreadable media. The digital allows texts and things we produce to travel much further across global networks than we might have, if we were exclusively in a kind of a print society. There's a risk to that. There's a shadow side to that, right? We'll talk about that as well. But the role of the digital has a place in liberatory analyses of aging. But what that might be, that is where we need to bring some critical consciousness. And that's what I'd like to move into now. These opportunities for thinking about the affordances of the digital realm. I'm going to talk about something specifically called digital storytelling, which I'll define in a moment. But just to give you a sense, and maybe some of this, you might know personally, or you might know it from discussions in the news and in the media. But one of the most common ways in which the digital and aging and older age have been kind of linked together is in sort of with respect to the issue of older people's supposed vulnerability to online fraud. That this is, when we're thinking about older age and the digital, often that's the line of connection that's drawn. Well, gosh, older folks might not be as familiar with phishing scams and these kinds of things. And that's where a lot of the focus on digital life with older people, that's where it's tended to kind of land. And don't get me wrong, it's as important a subject as any. I would argue that it's just as important for younger people to be aware of the sophistication of online fraud, but that tends to be on the technology side, sort of, that there is some sort of problem or inherent issue of older folks in engaging with technology, that it's confusing, and that's where we ought to be sort of focusing. And that, again, I'll put the ageist assumptions that kind of involves aside for a moment. Happy to talk about it later if you like. But for me, that is not exactly an example of the liberatory, possibilities of thinking about the digital with aging and older age. And in fact, something that I've noticed is almost entirely the aesthetic potential, the artful opportunities to think about aging and older age through the digital realm. That's not something we tend to kind of focus on. And that's, for me, that's where it's just like, oh, let's get aesthetic, let's see where the beauty lies, where the art, where can we generate art and these kinds of knowledges that are intrinsic to the sort of more expressive media of the arts and humanities. So just a quick overview of, and I want to make it very clear, of course there are really, marvelous engagements of sort of the aesthetic potential of aging in the digital realm. But I just want to, when you just have like a couple of like little pet things, you're just like, I have to show everybody this thing I found. Two here, this one in particular on the, gosh, okay, so the left, yes, okay, everything's on the left. The left is an online digital text by Stu Campbell. It's called "These Memories Won't Last." And it is, if you have the chance to Google it, it is a incredible example of it's a summary of the artist's discussions with his grandfather, who is a Holocaust survivor. And it is, as you can see, kind of illustrated in a kind of cartoony, graphic way. and you scroll through in a very, I'd say, contemplative and slow pace. You scroll through this vertical text online. So you go to the page and it's just this ongoing scrolling on a vertical perspective. Beautiful music and sort of speech bubbles that are sharing the grandfather's story. And what's interesting is the words only come up for kind of a limited amount of time before fading away. And even more compelling to me is the way that this particular really stunning example of a graphic narrative online, the artist actually designed it so that over time, it would no longer be compatible with certain web pages or the language of the internet. And so it too will one day not exist. It will be unreadable to future travelers on the internet in a really, I found a very striking convergence of form and content, right? So there's an example of like, digital obsolescence being used as a kind of signal or opportunity to think aesthetically about the realities of life course and end of life. And that it's an extraordinary example. And I just hope if you get one thing from this talk, if you just go and look at that, I hope you really enjoy it. If indeed it is still up. I actually didn't click on it before I gave the talk today, I clicked on the talk today, so fingers crossed. There are, I would say, again, more critical opportunities to think about aging and digital opportunities. And some of the critics that I'm thinking of include Amelia DeFalco, who's done a lot of work on, again, the kind of critical potential and possibilities of robot caregiving. That's not something I know an enormous amount about, but Amelia DeFalco, who's at Leeds, if I'm not mistaken, has some marvelous books on it, incredible writer. And similar sort of applications in the context of virtual reality and augmented reality, what are called empathy exercises that involve, often in the context of health professional training, putting on one of these kind of headsets to simulate the effect of, say, having cataracts or age-related disabilities or conditions that might be helpful for a, whether it's a young or certainly whether it's a junior, say, a medical professional, to have in order to understand why older folks might have difficulty, interacting in a clinical space the way they might expect a younger or able-bodied person to do. So there's all sorts of opportunities, right? That's ripe for critical analysis that comes out of the humanities. That's not necessarily where I focus, but I just wanted to share it with you as, again, just like stuff that's happening around aging and the digital that, again, just might pique your interests. Here is where my interest gets hooked, and that is around this topic of digital storytelling. It is a method in many ways that originated in the late 1990s in San Francisco at a place called the Center for Digital Storytelling. It's now called it's gone through 4 name changes. So of course, at this moment, I can't recall the most recent one, but it started off as the Center for Digital Storytelling. And I think it might now be called Story Center, which is this kind of hub for this digital storytelling method. What you need to know, and I will be showing you some examples. So I just want to kind of give you a sense of things now. We'll be seeing some in just a little while. It is we can think of it as a person-centered creative medium for exploring any kind of individual experience. For me, my own work has focused on individual experiences of health and illness and aging in particular, but there's no reason why it has to be directed towards those particular topics. Usually they are short audio-visual clips, and by short, we're talking like 2 to 5 minutes. And they're usually, you can think of them almost as a collage of photographs, videos. There's often a first person sort of voiced narrative, sort of like a voiceover on top of what it is you're seeing, as well as like ambient sounds or outdoor sounds, music that people might be overlaying on top of the visuals that you see. So it really is a collage or a blend of media types. And what has been happening is that digital storytelling has being increasingly used in the context of what's called participatory action research, which is, for those of you online or in person here who aren't familiar, a approach to research that involves those who are being researched. So the participants in research become part of the research process, as opposed to what we might think of as more kind of conventional research relationships in which I am the researcher, there are my participants, I am going to, there's a questionnaire or an interview or so on, they're there, I'm here, I do my analysis and I produce my work. Participatory action research asks for a flow and, as much as possible, engagement of participants in this kind of work. So digital storytelling becomes, I think, a really nice example of how participatory action principles, are sort of taking hold, taking root in disciplines where that kind of approach is quite unconventional, medicine and health-related areas especially. So one of the things in my publications around intergenerational, there you go. There's a new word for us all. Intergenerational digital storytelling in the work that I've been publishing on that recently. And this is where you kind of begin to see my work, like as a literary critic, kind of coming to the surface too, kind of bubbling up. One of the things I've noticed about digital storytelling is that it tends to bear a lot of resemblance to what literary critics would call the lyric mode. It's often very brief. It has in its language a lot of lift. There's a lot of metaphor. There's a lot of associative kind of elliptical ways of thinking or contemplating the world. There's the convention of a single speaker with an indeterminate audience, right? The poem, the digital story is sort of offered up with a sort of a speaker's voice, speaking out into in a very lyrical kind of way. And so I've been recently thinking about and trying to kind of, I suppose, justify it in some respects, digital storytelling sort of through a literary lens as multimedia storytelling in a lyric mode. And that, again, just for those of you for whom the lyric means things, that might just help give you a further flavor of what digital storytelling involves. And that's quite different, I would say. That lyrical element makes digital storytelling quite different from, say, what we might think of as like straight up documentaries or even short films, fictional narratives, for example, or more instrumentalized videos or digital materials that might be used in a sort of more like public service or health education kind of way to communicate information. They are less directly teacherly than they are, as I said, sort of evocative in the way that literature is. And if we can listen to the lesson that a digital storytelling offers, wonderful, but they're not there to instruct us as to, how to insert an IV into a vein or something of that matter. It's not instructive, but it has, of course, a possibility of doing so if we choose and are able to sensitize our listening to it. So not age exactly at all, actually, but Project Revision is a Canadian example of a health and illness and actually increasingly disability related initiative based in Guelph that is just a marvelous example of digital storytelling for these kinds of purposes. And this is just again just a sort of a shout out to folks that are doing really extraordinary work. Project Revision, and they've got a website. They've also now got a focus on disability led by Eliza Chandler at Toronto Met University. So some really exciting work going on here. But to focus now on aging, digital storytelling with an aging bent. And again, I realize this is getting a little small for those of you that are here. The text is getting a little bit small, but while I think it's one thing I want to say is that I've just been talking about digital storytelling with respect to like health and illness. I want to make it really clear, and I think when we think about digital storytelling with respect to aging, it's really important not to sort of say, oh, health and illness and aging, as if those things, especially illness and aging, as if they are concurrent. They are not. That said, that intensity of experience or that opportunity to use digital storytelling as a way of thinking about what it means to grow old or aging experience share some of, again, just some of these kind of principles of storytelling that, again, make it, for me, a kind of an adjacent practice. But I don't want, in case you were wondering, I don't want to give the impression that aging as decline or as an illness is something I'm just sort of assuming. Not at all. And we'll see some of the examples of that in just a moment. So for me, and this is a sort of a summary of various definitions of intergenerational storytelling, one of the ways I've been defining and working with the idea of intergenerational storytelling is the sharing of personal or collective memories of lived experience, often as it's told from one distinct generation to another. And of course, in talking about a generation, we have to remember like scales, right? That might be one person from one generation talking to one person of another generation. It might be a larger scale of a sort of a generational tale that is then told sort of to a larger cohort. So the question of scale is certainly at stake here, but the idea of like generations and or their representatives talking across that distinction, that those are the sharing of personal and collective memories, that's kind of the essence of intergenerational storytelling, digital or otherwise. And what we've seen in the last 5 to 7 years, I'd say, is the emergence of what we might call born digital intergenerational storytelling initiatives. That is, intergenerational initiatives, digital storytelling initiatives that were always sort of just meant to be consumed through the internet or online, as opposed to being digitized stories that were collected in other media and then digitized. Born digital refers to initiatives, and I've just named a few from North America and Europe here, refers to initiatives that were kind of born to be, I have born to be wild in my head, but like born to be digital. And certainly the Resemblage Project, which I'll introduce you into in a moment, is an example of one of those as well. So then to narrow down yet again, 2 other Canadian examples of intergenerational digital storytelling. I'd just like to make a shout out to the Aging Activisms group at Trent University, led by May Chazan, that have been doing really interesting activist, personal, as well as theoretical work that's drawn out of digital storytelling. So they've got not only an amazing website, but some pretty awesome, like they have merch too, like they've got buttons and clothes. And I just think that it's really nice to sort of look at this kind of work and sort of see like awesome images. There's also, again, in Peterborough, a group called Aging Vitalities, led by Nadine Changfoot, who have been, again, very active around using digital storytelling to upset certain assumptions around aging and the life course. And I'll read very briefly a suggestion or a statement by Nadine here. We are socialized and shaped to think of a human life in singular terms, as linear, proceeding forward. And that's a very typical way we sort of talk about certainly Western relationships to time and life course. We begin at birth, and then we kind of march along to adolescence, and then we carry along to adulthood, and so on and so forth. And then the line ends, right, at some point. So we're socialized into thinking about that. But are there ways, spoiler alert, there are ways of thinking otherwise. And in fact, that is a deeply acculturated way of thinking about time. And opportunities exist to think of time in a much more sort of circular spiral sort of outlook, particularly when we don't prioritize the meaning or the tracking of the singular individual lifespan. When we think about life as something amidst a generation. And those are coming out of, again, more complex histories than I'm able to share with you right now, but in terms of Indigenous worldviews and even some of the Black feminist liberatory outlooks that I was describing earlier. So we have options. Can we find them? That's the question these kinds of initiatives ask us, provoke us to discover. One of the ways that digital storytelling is or can be understood in terms of that liberatory analysis, that kind of activist approach, as I was describing earlier, is its possibilities as a counter narrative. And counter narrative is, for those of you that are not familiar with the terms of qualitative research, a counter narrative is, to quote here, helps us splinter widely accepted truths about people, cultures, and institutions. So a counter narrative is often a story that goes against what we might expect to happen within an institution or within a certain set of experiences. Digital storytelling tends to attract and represent counter narratives about some aspect of human experience. So that's what makes them really juicy. That's what makes them real opportunities to do that work or help do that work of jumpstarting the otherwise, thinking otherwise. We can begin with some of these counter narratives, and digital storytelling is really good at kind of bringing those to the fore. Counter narratives are also often, I have found, a way of exploring or sensing the impacts of what we might call in other discourses, the social determinants of health. So these are aspects of our existence, whether it's economic status, race, gender, our postal code, where it is we live, these aspects of our lives that are maybe not clinically, like on the individual level, relevant to, you know, whether we're able to manage our diabetes, for example, but they do have an impact on our claim or our ability to realize a condition of health or to manage our illnesses in ways that are amenable to folks. So that's interesting to sort of think of counter narrative as a word drawn from sort of the qualitative and critical social sciences especially, but it really does kind of resonate with these impacts of the social determinants of health. It's almost like a kind of an analog or a kind of a metal detector for sensing where social determinants of health might have special impact on a certain experience, aging or otherwise. And it's important as a result to think about how the opportunity to provide, this is all sounding really good, right? Like I'm trying to make a really exciting case, you know, for digital storytelling as the sort of liberatory analysis. And if we only all just told digital stories and went through this method and did this process, everything would be better. And yes, I think that's true. That said, again, I think whenever we are presented with a tool is always also a weapon, right? And one of the ways that we can kind of think, again, a little more critically, realistically, or just in a more measured fashion about the possibilities of digital storytelling is to turn to technology scholars that have been anxious and warning us for quite some time now about the possibility of digital spaces, the risk and the dangers of them, especially for the ways that digital spaces can amplify phenomena like racism and racial segregation, colonization, and colonial outlooks, just to name a few, say nothing of gender and sexism and so on. If you have been paying attention to any of the recent critical discussion around social media, or indeed any of the recent critical discussions around artificial intelligence, all of which has been sort of facilitated by life online, that has resulted in very immediately and profoundly, I would say profoundly concerning instances of racism. All of a sudden, that ability to spread messages throughout global networks enabled by the digital also allows things like racism and colonization, colonial outlooks, these really dangerous isms to spread with just the same kind of smoothness that we might hope more liberatory viewpoints might as well. So that's, again, just a tool as a weapon. And there's always, I think, whenever we're excited about something, it's really important to sort of look at what is at risk in kind of doing something without a full recognition of what its risks or drawbacks might be. So I use that word spreadable, and this is coming out of media studies, and particularly I like it. It's a great word. Henry Jenkins, the media scholar Henry Jenkins, provides it for us to talk about the ways in which, as I've just been describing, media can spread. Spreadable media can kind of occur through these digital networks, which might, on the one hand, be, you know, a real boon. It might also, and because it is in attention with the ways that it's important to remember that any story, especially an individual story, is deeply situated in a place, in an experience, in the particular, right? So whenever we're looking to use the digital to spread stories around, we have to remember that whatever story that's being spread is also the product of something that is very singular in some ways. And again, that may have its own risks or concerns. Certainly as participants doing this kind of work, of providing, you know, doing digital storytelling, we might be concerned that, do they want their particular story of aging or health-related experience, do they want that spread around, right? These are concerns that as participatory action researchers, we have to grapple with and attend to very carefully in this kind of work. So what I want to do is suggest to you that digital stories of the kind we're just about to see are a kind of research assemblage. And this is an important word for me, that they are, you know, documents that are at once, you know, theoretically motivated. They are experientially motivated. They are, you know, coming out of a time where we are interested and fascinated in some extent to the digital, but we are also integrating all those new fascinations with very ancient human practices of storytelling and sharing stories across generational distinctions, generational lines, and so on. So that's why I like to use the word assemblage, that it is a kind of a collage of all of these things together. It is unruly, but again, it's in those unruly moments that I think we can begin to learn to think in a different way about something that might seem very obvious to us, like aging and what it means. I'll just take a moment here for both some water and just entering the third part of our presentation. And don't worry, we do have a little bit more to go, but I'll leave lots of time for discussion in just a moment. So what I'd like to do now is introduce to you my own engagement with these ideas that I've been sharing with you as a kind of this has been a big wind up, right? This has been what, 25 slides of wind up? Okay, I've got my baseball bat and we're about to hear a crack, a good crack, like a home run crack, not the walls are falling in crack. Just again, everything has two sides, right? A crack, bad, an opportunity. So what I want to do is introduce to you an aging-focused intergenerational digital storytelling initiative that I've been assembling since 2019. But as I said, you know, it really did begin a few years before that. And it's called the Resemblage Project. So I was talking about materially situating our work. A lot of this work materially, certainly pandemic aside, was done in, or certainly has a focus on, Scarborough, which is obviously just on the probably well known to many folks in this room, probably on Zoom as well. You know, part of the east end of the GTA. And that's actually where my primary departmental affiliation is. So a lot of the undergraduates I teach at the Scarborough campus in the Department of Health and Society. A lot of the students that I'm teaching are, you know, from that area really that you're seeing highlighted in red there. Higher than average number of students that are identified with racialized communities or equity deserving groups. So it gives a very particular, and I would say, to go back to some of the earlier points I was making, it's a real motivator for me, again, as a white settler woman professor, to ensure that the work that I'm sharing and the teaching that I'm doing is resonating in some way, you know, with my students. So asking me to think differently about not only the work that I teach, but how might my research be, again, I hope, why are we teaching? Why are we researching? In order to spark the imaginations of our future colleagues. That's what I'm trying to do. So the Resemblage Project is an attempt on my part to begin some of this. And that's a portmanteau. If you're just like, is she saying it wrong? No, it's a word I made up. I get to do that now. I have tenure. Resemblage, it's a portmanteau that's mingling some of the words I have already used in this presentation, right? Resemblance, assemblage, and age. And it's a community-based digital storytelling initiative. And right now we have 18 digital stories, as well as an extensive, and this is actually, I would say, a hallmark of the digital humanities piece that we have on our website. There's a whole, I think of it as a scrapbook of documents that show our process. Yes, we have the kind of the finished stories, and I'll show you a couple of them in just a moment. But we also, in the digital humanities kind of way of things, really interested in like, how did you get there? Like, what's the kind of process of getting there? And I'll show you a little video of that that gives you a sense of the flavor in just a moment. Won a couple of awards. Quite pleased about that in 2020 and 2021. So we're making an impact, and it's speaking to people. This is exciting to me, and obviously I'm very, very proud of that. So as I said, this is an assemblage. The website is going to kind of demonstrate that if you go and take a look at it. It's an assemblage of theory, of the digital stories, but it's also coming out of experiential learning. And I'd just like to maybe plug that as a real opportunity, especially for those of us, in the humanities that might not be used to thinking of the work that we do as experiential or social, that in digital storytelling, you've got a chance to kind of do some of that skill building. I know I'm using kind of trigger words here, but skill building, socializing work of storytelling that is at once an opportunity for individuals to tell a story, but they're also in a small group, enabling and developing this storytelling of others. So it has a bit of that kind of classroom alchemy that I think those of us, certainly from the humanities, we know it, and when we don't have it, we miss it, right? It's nice to be able to generate that. It started as a very small scale exhibit at Gallery 1265 in early 2019. And the success of showing these stories there, it was 7 stories at that time, I believe, along with a chapbook. So I have sort of spread them around. I'll just show you. You don't have to look at them now. Sorry, I'm going to leave the mic for a sec. This is an example of the chapbook. They're just spread around the world, around the room. What's the difference? Around our little world, which you're welcome to take a look at if you like. You can take it, but it's also a written version of the 7 videos that were shared as part of this little gallery show, and I'm just so proud of it. And it's a modest little thing, but especially for the students, this was publishing a book. This was a material aspect of what they did. And I'll come back to that because that was actually transformative. And that's something that began to trigger for me. Just having this little chapbook, I spent $50 and got these printed up at a print shop. It helped me, and it's part of some of the new writing that I'm doing that makes me think differently about why this work matters. I'll talk about it in my conclusion. What I'd like to do actually is skip this video, and we're just going to dig right into one of the digital stories. It's about 3 minutes long. And I'm actually going to withhold comments on the digital stories because, again, I want to seed our discussion. I'm going to skip over this one, and we're going to go right into a digital story that is on the website. And it's one that I think is, well, what do you think it is? I hope this works for everybody.
Departure. This is the part where I'm supposed to show you a picture of my grandparents, but I don't have any. I left them back in my homeland, the same way I left the last grandparent that I have. We left reluctantly, but the desire for a better life for this young family had to be prioritized by mom and dad. Migration took away my final chance at a generational relationship. One generation's pursuit of a better life meant abandoning another. We belong to a huge family tree. My parents have 10 siblings each. But just as how the wind blows away leaves from a tree, ambition blew us away to a solitary place. We've been displaced, believed we'll be back in no time. The plan has always been to come back to you. You remember? See you in 3 years. I couldn't wait to come back home. 2 years later, your visa was approved. You said you were coming here soon. But a few months after, you departed. To tell you the truth, I'm still at the unsaid part. I've neglected the pain for as long as I can remember. As much as I hated when you pinched my cheeks, I'd do anything to take it all back. Maybe you should have pinched me harder to knock some sense into me, because I don't think I've expressed my love. I don't think I've done enough.
Thank you, Angelus. As I said, I'd like to withhold comments on that just because I'll be so interested to hear what your impressions of this are. One thing I will just share, though, is that Angelus is a health studies student who said, I can't do this. I don't have anything creative to say. I've never done anything creative. It's not for me. This is nice, but it's for other people. And this is what she makes. So I'm going to skip ahead again, just in the service of time. Just I would have one more video clip, but again, I'm happy to maybe show it later rather than front load things. Hey. Oh. Okay, great. I was trying to skip over that part, but Charise, thank you, but we'll turn to you another time. So again, these are, again, a sense of the flavor of the stories that are on the Resemblage Project website. And there's about 18, I think, of those now, along with a really, I think, provocative set of documents that that little clip that just snuck in with Charise and others, you know, really nice online, some online conversations that we had during the pandemic, because we had another wave of stories that were uploaded to the website last summer that were created entirely under the conditions of lockdown. And one of the reasons, again, I'd love to show it to you if we have time, and if people are just like, we want to see it, I will show it. But otherwise, it was really interesting to see how the conditions of lockdown were asking these students to think about their own experiences in terms of their own aging and the passing of time, and the phenomenology, if you will, of time's passing, again, in ways that struck me as atypical for health studies students. It's quite a thing to see. So I promised you, and I want to give you a sense not just of the Resemblage Project, but by way of a conclusion, just how the Resemblage Project fits into the larger kind of constellation of work that I've had the opportunity to lead in recent months and years. And the first is Flourish, which is a cluster of scholarly prominence at the University of Toronto Scarborough, launched, again, I talked about Born Digital a couple of slides ago. I think there should also be a thing called like Born Pandemic. We were in the midst of lockdown, and that's when this cluster of scholarly prominence launched. So it really has been a pandemic-shaped informed and deformed in some respects initiative funded by the research office at the UTSC for more than $500,000. So obviously very pleased to see community engaged arts getting that kind of support internally. We are focused as a multidisciplinary team. We are focused on the ways in which arts engagement can facilitate something we are calling social wellness. So that is wellness that goes beyond just individual clinical markers, but speaks to the ways in which doing things together, enhancing elements like community belonging, flourishing, might enhance a sense of something that feels a lot like health in a community sense, right? So thinking about that matter of scale, thinking about health from beyond like the clinical and individual measures into something that is a little more relational, a lot more relational. We're a multidisciplinary team. We have physicians, we have experts in arts-based as well as health research methods, fine and performing arts, assessment and education science, and knowledge translation. And we have several community partners that I'll just flash up in just a moment that are drawn from arts organizations as well as community health centers and social research initiatives. We just received a SSHRC partnership development grant. So again, wonderful to get that initial support from UTSC, but to get the imprimatur of SSHRC is quite a thing, and obviously very proud of that recent good news. Here are just some of our partners, and I wanted to show you them so that you could see that some of our sub-projects that are involving these partners will, you'll recognize them from this slide. One of the sub-projects that I wanted to just, again, super briefly gloss was a 2-year project that we just got funded from the University of Toronto's Connaught Community Partnership Research Program, involving one of our partners, Scarborough Arts, doing community engaged arts work with LGBTQ youth, and looking at the opportunities arts engagement offers for these youth to think about the importance of having access to the arts over the course of their lives, and the ways in which that can facilitate feelings of belonging, feelings of wellness that go beyond just the sort of clinical, sort of hospital-based measures that we might be used to thinking about health with, why we use that language of wellness. The other sub-project that I just wanted to share with you, again, very exciting, recently funded by the New Frontiers and Research Fund. It's called, I'm going to read it to you and I'm going to tell you what it's actually about. It's called Mobilizing Creative Arts Access Equity for Post-Pandemic Flourishing in Canada, a Participatory Action Approach. And I'm losing a bracket there. So it's all, you know, it's all there. That is all true. But basically what it is we want to do is we want to make an art bus. We want to get a bus and we want to fill it full of art supplies, and we want to drive it to where anybody who wants it can get it, help them make art, and find out what happens. I've given it away. Obviously, we have to sort of like do some sort of landscape research and all these before, but like that's the goal. So if you have any access to a bus that you don't want anymore, or you have access to like capital funds that I can, you know, we can talk. That's the big plan. And that's what we're up to there. And we're using the example of the effectiveness of mobile vaccination units, as we saw over the course of the pandemic, as a kind of an analog. It's like, well, if that helps bring COVID-19 vaccinations to communities that might not be able or inclined to get vaccinated otherwise, can we see the same thing about arts engagement? If we bring arts to those communities that, for whatever reason, do not have access to that kind of arts engagement, what happens? What happens when that access barrier is diminished? We need a bus. If you can get us a bus, talk to me. Okay, thanks. Thanks. So the takeaway, and this is my second to last slide here, what I'd like to suggest, what I've hoped to show you is how a liberatory life course view of aging means not only thinking about, but crafting multi-directional forms of legacy and generational connection. And when I say legacy, that can be a really heavy word, right? And it's often, I think, for many of us, something that we think of as only going in one direction, right? From one generation to the younger next generation. But one of the things that the Resemblage Project and these other projects are suggesting is that arts engagement can be a kind of technology of legacy making, of crafting legacies that cross and weave the life course across distance and time, on the singular as well as on the collective scale. And for me, arts engagement through those ways becomes itself a kind of a counter narrative. I mentioned Angelus as a health studies student saying, I'm not creative. That's not what I do. This is nice, but it's not for me. I think bringing this kind of arts engagement and enabling that access to arts engagement in the ways that we've done with digital storytelling in other modes as well, I think that changes and creates a counter narrative as to who has the right to make things. And I think that does something really transformative for folks young and old alike. If you're all of a sudden told, you not only I want you to make things, but you have the right to, that becomes, I think, an element of wellness that belongs in our discussion of what it is we need to be well in our communities. So in conclusion, I hope that we can have a discussion around how high quality arts engagement experiences like digital storytelling, but by no means the only example of that they do occasion really meaningful human interactions. And through that interactivity, and by soliciting local and maybe in some ways like unusual definitions of value regarding aging, for example, that's how we can look at arts engagement as a catalyst of social wellness. And that's a term that I'm using to reframe this idea of the social determinants of health in order to uplift and center in some ways community strengthening practices that underscore not only the value, but the values of arts and humanities-centered work, which include, in the work that we've been doing, equity, access, belonging, intergenerativity, and above all, justice. So I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank you in there for hopping on the Zoom for this presentation. I'd also just like to say thanks to my kind of key collaborators, Dirk, Celeste, Mia, and Nihal, and especially to the storytellers and those that I focused on today, but both sets, all sets from 2019, 2021, and beyond. Thanks for your time and for your attention.